Oh, yeah, she's all. I know, I don't, we're meant to know, and so right now. Oh, I know.
Okay, so today we're gonna finish up with the heart, but before we do, I want to point out some things to you so I don't forget at the end of class. So I posted a number of things. So if you want more review activities for this fourth exam, I put up a bunch here for you. This is kind of the order I might recommend you do them in. These two in the middle are like Google Forms that'll score your answers. So practice questions on the cardiac cycle and cardiac output specifically. This first one is a worksheet covering all the material that we've covered for exam 4 with activities. It has a link to the key on the last page. Same thing is true for the fourth one. This is a worksheet, kind of linked up to your textbook, key linked at the end of the document. What you're probably more interested in is I created for the final exam kind of like a breakdown of what you should expect in terms of questions. So final exam, when we have it next week, is 16 questions, 4 from each of the 4 units. We'll be focused on major topics and overarching themes, but to help you identify those themes, I've outlined what I think 4 major topics for each of our exams would be. So basically, I kind of expect a question for each of these bullet points in this list. So target your studying appropriately. Sound good? Okay. So once practicals tomorrow are over, I will put in everybody's lab grades. So you'll take your final knowing what you got on all your exams, what all your lab points are, everything will be tallied up. Final probably shouldn't take you very long because it's only 16 questions. And then you'll have the opportunity to retake one of your exams if you want to at that point, after knowing exactly where you are in this class.
Is the final multiple choice?
Yep, it's just like your other exams. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? 16, yeah, 4 per unit, is short.
Okay.
Yeah, the final itself is not the biggest deal.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, you know, you don't want to like not take an exam, but should be less stressful than our unit exams. Okay. So we are going to wrap up with the heart today. So when we finished, our last day was Monday, we were talking about cardiac output. So cardiac output, abbreviated CO, is the amount of blood going out to your body per minute. And that means that the way we find it is we need to know how much blood your heart is pumping out per heartbeat. That's your stroke volume. And we're going to multiply that by how many heartbeats there are in a minute, your heart rate. Okay. So we're talking about how we can regulate cardiac output, how we can change it, right? So if we want to increase our cardiac output, if we want to get more blood out to the body faster, right? So say we're in a fight or flight situation, right? Something stressful. We're thinking sympathetic nervous system related. We're going to do something that increases either or really both of these factors, right? So if you increase the stroke volume, increases your cardiac output. You increase your heart rate, increases cardiac output, because that's how math works. And we can do the reverse as well, right? So if we're resting, we want to give our heart a break. If your heart works too hard, that's not great for your heart either, right? So if you want to decrease your cardiac output, you could decrease stroke volume. We're going to find out that that's actually like a little bit harder. That's a little bit trickier than increasing stroke volume. But you could decrease stroke volume. I'm going to add a question mark just because it's a little harder. Definitely decreasing heart rate, slow down your heart, slow down your cardiac output, give yourself a rest because your tissue doesn't have that high of an oxygen demand, right? Because you're like not using muscles as much, right? So you don't need to produce as much ATP. Okay, so you have a kind of like a lower need for blood flow a little bit. Okay, so that's where we were. We're talking about the ways that we can regulate that. So we talked about how our sympathetic nervous system coming from the thoracolumbar region of the spine has projections to our pacemaker cells in the SA node and the AV node. So it can increase your heart rate, which would increase your cardiac output. And it also has connections to the ventricular myocardium, so the heart muscle itself. So it can increase stroke volume by making those cells contract faster, contract harder, basically. Our main way of decreasing cardiac output, at least in terms of the factors associated with the heart itself. We'll talk about factors associated with blood vessels in A&P 2. But for the heart itself, if you want to decrease cardiac output, it's going to be mostly with your parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Parasympathetics only have a connection to the pacemaker cells, right? So particularly the SA node is the node full of pacemaker cells that's really setting the pace for your heart. So your parasympathetics for the heart are coming from cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. So we can slow down the heart rate fine with our vagus nerve, but we don't have a connection to the muscle cells of the heart. We don't have a connection to that ventricular myocardium with our parasympathetics, which is why I was saying that decreasing stroke volume is a little trickier because we can't do it in this analogous route, right? Sympathetics can make the heart squeeze harder. Parasympathetics can't make it squeeze like weaker. It can really just slow the heart down. So those were our main extrinsic pathways for regulating cardiac output. We saw that there are some hormones that affect the heart, glucagon and epinephrine. Epinephrine, we really just kind of like lump in with the sympathetics in terms of its effects. Glucagon is just kind of like low priority for us in this course, but hormones would also be extrinsic effects on the heart, on cardiac output. Okay. So when we are thinking about linking it all together or integrating the heart rate control, right? So we're going to make sure that we realize that both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are linked to that SA node that's setting the pace for our heart, right? So we're always going to have some kind of dynamic interaction between the sympathetics and the parasympathetics because we have that dual innervation that we talked about, right? So at rest, if you're just sitting around, your parasympathetics should be dominating, which is why your baseline heart rate is less than 100 beats per minute, 100 beats per minute being the baseline rate at which the SA node pacemaker cells would fire without any communication from those nerves. Okay. Sympathetic neurons let the SA node get to its baseline rate and then overshoot it as they project to that SA node. So sympathetics and epinephrine raise heart rate, parasympathetics to that SA node could lower your heart rate. And that's our equation again, right? So cardiac output there, how much we get per minute blood flow to our organs, stroke volume, how much blood per heartbeat the heart is pumping into the aorta, heart rate, how many beats per minute. Okay. So now we got basically the outline of what's going on with stroke volume. Okay. So did just tell you the sympathetic nervous system can increase stroke volume because it's connected to that myocardium, or sorry, myocardium. But we do have some other things that are involved. So when we talk about that sympathetic nervous system connection, what we're really affecting is the ventricular contractility. So how much the ventricles contract, right? So that's that piece that we're regulating with the sympathetic nervous system. But we're also going to see that there are effects of how much blood is in the heart and how much pressure is in the heart and how much pressure is in the aorta that affect how much blood that you can pump out, right? Because our stroke volume is calculated by looking at our end diastolic volume. I'm not going to make you do like real math on the exam, but we do want to know how all these relationships work, right? So if we have our end diastolic volume, that's how much blood has filled our heart, minus our end systolic volume, which is how much blood is left in the heart at the end of contraction, right? That is what our stroke volume is, right? Because the stroke volume is the amount that left the heart, right? That's why these two numbers are different, okay? So we're going to see that if you want to affect that stroke volume, like one thing you could do is affect how much blood went to the heart in the first place, right? If you affect your starting amount, then you can affect that end amount, right? So that's one way that you can affect that stroke volume. That's what's going on in this part. And another thing that we're going to see that can change stroke volume. So if we think about where everything's going, right? So we got our heart, we have its 4 chambers, okay? We know that things are moving because of pressure differences, right? I'm drawing our aorta here, okay, because it's coming out of the left ventricle, okay? So we know that things move from high to low pressure, right? So high pressure to low pressure is how we end up with things moving from chamber to chamber in the heart and from the various chambers into the arteries. So high pressure to low pressure. Okay. So this last piece after load is going to have to do with those pressure differences, right? So specifically, we're going to see, right, our heart has to pump against any pressure that exists in the aorta, right? So you're going to need to have higher pressure in the ventricle versus lower pressure in the aorta if you want those semilunar valves to open and let the blood through, okay? And then for the blood to actually flow. So if you change pressure in the blood vessels, right? Like if you make it harder to push blood out of the heart, basically, right? Like if you have a higher pressure here, harder to push out, you're going to end up decreasing how much blood escapes the heart because it's just like hard to squeeze it out. So we're going to see that that effect is called afterload, and it also affects stroke volume. Okay. And then the next slides are really going to show all of this, right? But that's our big takeaway really for all of this. Okay. So when we're thinking about changes in stroke volume, the first thing and the easiest thing we can think about is how hard does the heart contract, right? Because it's the heart contracting, specifically the ventricles contracting, squeezing that blood out, right? They're raising the pressure in the ventricle. It overcomes pressure in the artery that they're pumping into, right? And that's how we get blood leaving the heart. So that's how stroke volume is able to happen, right? We eject that blood during our ventricular ejection phase of the cardiac cycle, okay? So if you squeeze harder, more forceful contraction, you can squeeze out more blood, higher stroke volume. Hopefully that's easy to logic through on your own, right? Like when you squeeze your tube of toothpaste too hard, too much toothpaste comes out. It's the same thing for your heart. Okay. So the piece we just need to know is that that's under sympathetic control. So your sympathetic nerves can make your heart squeeze harder because they innervate those muscle cells, okay? So sympathetic postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine. That's their hormone, their neurotransmitter, let's say. Okay. Norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors, specifically in the ventricular myocardium. We have beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So they trigger that cyclic A&P messenger system. So they're activating cyclic A&P. And what cyclic A&P does in the ventricular myocardium, so in that heart muscle, is it opens calcium channels. There were some already open. This is why it says augment, it like opens more, basically. Also increases the release of calcium from your sarcoplasmic reticulum. Right, so these two things together, we know that calcium is important because it lets cross-bridge cycling happen, which is why muscles squeeze, right? That calcium binds to troponin, pushes tropomyosin off the myosin binding sites on actin, okay? That's the point of calcium, right? Which lets you do the cross-bridge cycle, lets muscle contract. So when we have the sympathetic nervous system putting out norepinephrine, opening calcium channels, right? Part of what that's going to do is increase cross-bridge cycling. Okay? So we can increase the myosin ATPase rate as well. And we can also increase the rate of calcium activity on the sarcoplasmic reticulum in terms of its reuptake. Okay. The big picture, most important parts of this to know are going to be, right, like more forceful contraction, bigger stroke volume. It's the sympathetic nerves that are doing it. And then, no, it has something to do with calcium. Know that calcium is important for the heart and the heart contracting, because we talked about that a little bit as we were talking about the depolarizations. Okay? So you don't have to fully memorize all of this, but do know those things. We're going to take a look just at how this is working, right? Part of this is also like helping us review that last unit, right? Because this is linked up, right? So we got that norepinephrine from the sympathetic nervous system, or epinephrine from the adrenal medulla, binding to beta-1 receptors, which are G protein coupled. That G protein breaks up. Part of it comes and touches an enzyme here. That enzyme takes ATP and makes you some cyclic A&P, right? So that's how we get from norepinephrine to cyclic A&P. And that's what the beta-1 receptor is kind of for here. Okay. Now, part of this pathway that happens in response to cyclic A&P being present is we're opening up calcium channels between that intracellular cytoplasm, right, that intracellular fluid, and that extracellular fluid. So all the liquid that this tissue is kind of floating in. Okay? So we get some calcium into the cell this way. And the other thing that's happening is that we're getting calcium into the cell from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is basically a storage location for calcium. At least that's how we think of it in terms of what it's doing for a muscle cell. Okay, so both of these ways, we've got more calcium in the cytoplasm. Great, we can do cross-bridge cycling. So we can see here, the green is the calcium, right? Use that color, right? So we can see that green calcium here is sitting on troponin. That's this pink snowman. The tropomyosin is this pink spaghetti. And the myosin binding sites on actin are these little olive pits, right? So now that they're exposed, myosin can grab its handhold on that myosin binding site on actin, aka this little olive pit, and it can push actin towards the center of a sarcomere, contracting the muscle. Okay. All right. Then we also want to relax, right? If we're contracting forcefully because of the sympathetic nervous system, right? Great, we want a high stroke volume, but we were also trying to raise our heart rate, right? So if you don't relax after contracting, right, like you're not gonna have a ton of effect on like pushing out lots of blood because you're not able to fill, right? So we're also going to relax kind of fast. So that's what 4 is about here, is that reuptake of calcium is also going to happen a little quicker so that we can relax. Okay, so here we see a comparison of what's happening in the ventricles in terms of how forcefully they're contracting at rest versus when we've got sympathetic nerves talking to them. So at rest, we got a nice little, just like kind of gentle curve. We got this hill. Sympathetic activity. It's when we increase heart rate and stroke volume, right? That's the purpose of the sympathetic nerves to the heart, really. So we can see that that tension is happening sooner, right? So this is also even showing us a little bit about that heart rate piece, even though its goal is to show us ventricular contractility, right? So that ventricular contractility part, we can see that the peak is higher. We have more force, more tension being produced. So we're squeezing harder, right? That difference is like how much we're squeezing harder. Right? So we contract sooner, we contract harder, and then we also relax faster so we can do it again for the next heartbeat. Okay. So in terms of the opposite, right? The sympathetics and the parasympathetics are just pretty much opposite to each other for like everything they do. But the parasympathetics don't actually connect to the ventricles. So there's no real significant interaction between that parasympathetic innervation and ventricular contractility. They just don't reach that far, so they can't really. Right. So in terms of hormones, epinephrine can also bind to beta-1 adrenergic receptors. So it would work the exact same way as the norepinephrine coming from the sympathetics would work. Nothing different about that pathway. Okay. Other hormones can also affect the force of contraction. So thyroid hormones, insulin, glucagon can all kind of act on that force of contraction. We're not going to think about them really, but other stuff going on in your body does have an effect on your heart. But this is our last day of class, so the details of that will be for if you are going into specific conditions that you're interested in that affect this. Okay. What we do want to know about is how the amount of blood in the heart affects the stroke volume. Okay, so here we're looking at our end diastolic volume. Okay. Diastole is when the heart is relaxed. So end of diastole, end of that relaxation part of the heart. The reason we're relaxing the heart, other than, we don't want to overuse our heart, is that it's only when we're relaxed that that heart can fill. If we're squeezed up tight, blood's not going to get in. It has no way to force itself in. We have to be relaxed, open, low pressure for blood to fill. So that's what's going on with our end diastolic volume. So at the end of diastole, this is when we've been relaxed for a long time, twice as long as we are in systole, that stress part, that contraction part of the heart. Okay. So at the end of diastole, this is like our maximum amount of blood that can fill into the heart. Okay. Now, that volume has an effect on stroke volume in an interesting way. Okay. So one thing is just like, if you start with more blood, you can squeeze out more blood. But it also affects contractility specifically, like how hard the heart squeezes, right? Not just like the starting amount, but also like literally the squeezing because of stretch on muscle fibers. Okay. So this was your extra credit question on the last exam, right? But if we remember our sarcomeres, okay, we have our Z-line, our actin. There's a real picture on the next slide of what we're about to talk about. I'm going to draw it out so that we can see step by step, right? So for optimal length for our sarcomere, right, we want the myosin cross bridges, basically the handholds for our cross bridge cycling. So we want them to overlap with the actin well, because it needs to grab the actin. Okay. Okay. And we also want to have space to move. We want the heart to have, or sorry, the muscle in general to have room for that myosin to slide, right? So if we're either too short or too long, we have weaker contraction of muscles, right? If we're too long, we don't have enough overlap. So we basically don't have enough grip on the actin. If we're too short, there's just nowhere to go, right? Like there's no way to get shorter. You're just going to end up kind of like crunching the sarcomeres. It's not going to get you much going. Okay. So that is the basis for what's going on with the end diastolic volume here. Okay. So your heart is not always the size that gives those muscle fibers of the heart optimal length. If you put more blood than normal into the heart, so if you increase end diastolic volume, you actually put those fibers closer to their optimal length, right? So basically you have to stretch out the heart a little bit to reach optimal length. You're like a little bit kind of like too small at your baseline size of the heart. So when you increase end diastolic volume, stretch those muscle fibers, you bring them closer to the optimal length, which means the contraction can now be greater with each heartbeat because you're starting at like the strongest point. And the result is that you have a greater stroke volume because you're contracting harder. So this kind of combined effect of you started with more blood, then you put the muscle fibers at their optimal length so they can contract really hard, so you can squeeze out all that extra blood that you put in. There's also a relationship here to our venous return. So we'll be talking about blood flow like next unit. So we won't go into that too much, but basically the way you can end up with end diastolic volume being higher, at least one way, is that you can increase how much blood is coming from the veins back into the heart. And you're partially doing that by changing pressures in the heart, making them extra low, making it easier for veins to bring blood back to the heart. So a lot of things are working here together. Okay? But our big picture takeaways that we want to know is end diastolic volume is increasing stroke volume. So end diastolic volume goes up, stroke volume goes up. Okay? And this is because end diastolic volume is stretching the fibers to their optimal length. So we do want to remember that these are called Starling's curves, Starling's law, because we're going to find another Starling related term in A&P 2. So we just want to remember that we've kind of seen one once before, because we're going to make sure that we can tell the difference later. So here we see the relationship between that end diastolic volume and the stroke volume. So this is showing you what those sarcomeres look like at different end diastolic volumes, right? So here, if we have like our normal amount of blood, you can see how this sarcomere like almost looks like it's already contracted, right? Like it's a little too crunched together. There's not much room to move here. So you can squeeze some, and you can squeeze out some blood. You have some amount of contractility, but if you increase that end diastolic volume, you can see now it looks like every other picture that we've drawn of a sarcomere because we keep drawing them at optimal length, right? So now we have the perfect amount of room, that perfect length, so that we can squeeze harder, squeeze out more blood, increase our stroke volume. So when we are thinking about these Starling curves, right, I'm going to orient us on this, right? So like what we were just looking at was this curve in the center. Okay. So this is a relationship between end diastolic volume and stroke volume that happens purely based on how much blood is in the heart, right? So a little bit of blood, a little bit of stroke volume, a lot of blood, more stroke volume. That's our initial curve, right? That's why it's a curve. This is a family of Starling curves, because what happens when you shift the nervous activity is not like just shifting one point. It's shifting that relationship in total, right? So if you increase sympathetic activity, right? If you have a low end diastolic volume, but high sympathetic activity, you're still going to have, for any given end diastolic volume, you're going to have more stroke volume, right? So that's why we have a whole curve here for the sympathetic activity, is that like, no matter the amount of end diastolic volume, if you also add on sympathetic activity, everything shifts up. So for every individual point, you would have greater stroke volume. By contrast, if you decrease the sympathetic activity, that whole relationship shifts down, right? So now, right, that same amount on the initial curve, where we had some low amount of stroke volume, right? But we have some. On this curve, as it's drawn with decreased sympathetic activity, so like there's no sympathetic innervation here happening, you don't have any stroke volume at all here, right? Now that's probably not actually going to happen in real life, but that's kind of the relationship here. So we shift the whole curve up and down with the sympathetic activity. So that's what's up with our end diastolic volume. And I just want to make sure that we mention these words. We're not going to mention them again in this class, but I think they will be important for like your future healthcare classes, assuming you're taking this class for a point rather than just because you're interested in A&P. I think most people are here for a reason, right? Okay. So when we're thinking about end diastolic volume and the way in which that is affecting stroke volume, heart rate stuff. Okay. There's a relationship between volume and pressure. Basically, if you have higher volume, you have higher pressure. Okay, so end diastolic volume and end diastolic pressure are subtly different, but in practice, they're kind of the same thing, right? If one is high, the other will be high, right? End diastolic pressure specifically is clinically referred to as preload. This is our preload, because this is like before we contract, right? So before we contract, we have our preload. Before we contract, right before we contract, that's the end of diastole, because diastole is relaxation. Okay. So that end diastolic pressure is going to be affected by filling time, by atrial pressure, and by the pressure of the veins going into the heart, right? So if you have longer to fill, you can put in more blood. If you have lower pressure in the atria, you can fill with more blood. If you have high pressure in the veins, then we're using a high to low gradient, going more into the heart, right? More blood into the heart. So preload, end diastolic pressure, and diastolic volume are all basically a measure kind of that beginning right before our heart contraction, about like what our starting state is. So if we have greater preload, greater end diastolic volume, right? We're going to be able to have greater stroke volume. We're going to be able to squeeze out more blood because we started with more blood. Okay. Afterload has to do with that second little picture that I drew, and why I was pointing out the aorta and those pressure differences to you at the beginning here. So afterload is the pressure in the aorta during ejection. So that afterload is kind of the force that we're fighting against, right? So if we have high afterload, this is going to tend to decrease stroke volume because we're trying to push against that afterload, right? This is kind of a force against stroke volume and therefore against cardiac output, which is part of why, like, you know, if you have cardiovascular disease, if your aorta like couldn't stretch the right way and therefore you're ending up with like too high pressure there, right? This is why that could cause heart problems, basically. Or if there's like blockage kind of anywhere in your body that's creating high pressure buildup here, that's going to end up kind of damaging your heart because we're kind of fighting against these pressures that come after the heart. Okay. So for those, we just really want to know our basic definitions. This is an example of a question asking us how to kind of like link up these factors, right? So we're trying to figure out what's happening, right? If we have low cardiac output, right? So if we observe that we saw a decrease in cardiac output, we saw a low cardiac output, we want to be able to explain that, right? So we're trying to explain that, figuring out how do we link together everything that can kind of affect our stroke volume, our heart rate, specifically asking about what would be happening with our sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. So take another second to link together everything, creating kind of this decrease. All right. Cool. Okay. So let's go through it. So when we're thinking about the sum total of what's going on, right? We're looking at a low cardiac output, so like low blood flow per minute, right? So I'm gonna just draw an arrow, like our cardiac output is down, okay? We wanna know why. So we've got our two factors. We have our stroke volume and our heart rate. Okay. Stroke volume times our heart rate. Okay. So that's how we get our cardiac output. Okay. We have ways that we can affect each of these, right? So before we think about the directions, right? We're going to think about stroke volume in terms of our nerves specifically, because we're just thinking about sympathetics and parasympathetics in this question, right? So we don't have to add in this end diastolic volume stuff, right? So stroke volume here is going to be affected only by the sympathetics because the parasympathetics don't go there, right? Vagus nerve doesn't get to the ventricles. Heart rate, however, that SA node is getting a signal from the sympathetic nervous system and from the parasympathetic nervous system. So both of them are going there. Now, we have to link together and use these connections to think about the fact that we're seeing a decrease. Okay. So if we want to decrease the cardiac output, right? Simplest way is to just decrease one of these numbers, right? So the way we could most simply decrease one of these numbers is through that parasympathetic innervation of the heart rate, right? Parasympathetics decrease heart rate. Okay. Okay. So an increase in parasympathetic activity decreases the heart rate, right? So increased parasympathetic activity decreases the heart rate, right? But in our second most popular answer choice, we did still have increased sympathetic activity decreasing the heart rate. But a problem here was that that increased parasympathetic activity isn't decreasing stroke volume, okay? So that's the problem there, the main problem. Okay. The other factors that are happening here, if we have a low cardiac output, this means we don't have a lot of sympathetic activity on either that stroke volume or that heart rate part, right? So increases in parasympathetic activity would increase stroke volume and heart rate and therefore increase cardiac output. So the reverse is also true. So if we see a decrease in sympathetic activity, that decrease in sympathetic activity decreases both stroke volume and the heart rate, right? So this gives us the sum total of everything that would be happening all together in this situation. We're asking about both of these branches of the autonomic nervous system because we have that dual innervation at all times of our effector organs, right? So any given effector organ, right? Our heart, our glands, our smooth muscle, right? We're going to have effects from both parts of that nervous system. We've got like a dimmer switch kind of thing going on. We don't have just like an on-off light switch happening. Okay. So that's linking to everything together and the kind of question you should expect, right? Like we're going to think about if we increase something, if we decrease something, how do we explain that? Which factors are connected to each other? Which factors aren't connected to each other? Which factors oppose each other? So I can see we're at time, which is good. I think that was all our topics for today. I did have some calculations in here, but I'm not actually making you do calculations, so it's okay that we're not going to practice math. And I posted a bunch of practice questions for you and showed you where they are. Thank you. Yep. Oh, just one more thing. I heard that like the Wi-Fi might have gotten weird during some of these recordings. So if you are looking for lecture videos and looks weird or looks like a part didn't work or something, go to the old lecture playlist that's also linked in your right space.
You know, like,